Before I get to the topic at hand, I wanted to clarify a claim from my last video, which may cast some doubt on whether one of the parallels I drew between the tribe of Gad and Switzerland are correct. I explained how the tribes of Reuben and Gad chose land east of the Jordan River, while the rest of their brothers were granted land to the west. These two tribes were ultimately separated from the rest by the Jordan River and Dead Sea, which I claim parallels the modern tribes of Reuben and Gad today. This is because Switzerland is Gad, and France is Reuben, and these two nations are separated from the rest of the European powers by rivers such as the Rhine, Danube, Loire, and Ebro. The thing is, many people will look at a map of modern Europe and point to the fact that Belgium and parts of Holland are also west of the Rhine, therefore believing what I said to be wrong. Understand that at multiple points in time, all land west of the Rhine and even lands extending westwards belonged to the French. Matter of fact, the Frankish tribe even traced their origins to Belgium and Holland. Not to mention, till this day, many of these regions still speak the French language. Therefore, these rivers still somewhat match the ancient allotment of Gad and Reuben. Maybe not perfectly, but you can definitely see a correlation. And with that said, let's now move to the topic of today's video, which is the identification of the tribe of Reuben. This is a tribe that I've experienced gradual interest in throughout my studies. I've always known myself to carry descent from France. However, I was unaware of just how much. In my video, My Ancient Tribes 1, I go through my father's My True Ancestry results, which show an admixture of numerous Indo-European tribes, with the most prominent being the Visigoths, Gauls, and Franks. Throughout this video, we will not only trace these groups back to the Scythians, but will also show how they have relatively high components of Reuben as compared to other Celtic and Germanic tribes. So with all that said, let's get into the first set of clues for Reuben's identification in the final days. This can be found in Genesis 49 as Jacob blesses his sons. Verse 3 to 4 states, "Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defiledst thou it." In this passage, we can see that not only is Reuben the firstborn, and therefore the birthright son, but he is also the first sign of Israel's strength, dignity, and power. Within this line is prophetic indication that post-captivity, Reubenites would be the first of Israelites to rise to prominence on a grand scale, and would likely be the first to defeat or subdue the enemy of Israel, which at the time was the Roman Empire, heavily descended from the tribe of Dan. In a bit, I will provide undeniable evidence that of all nations on earth, France is the only one to fulfill all points of criteria when it comes to Reuben's Genesis 49 prophecy. That being said, this is a series debunking Black Hebrew Israelite propaganda, so let's first explain why their identification of Seminole Indians as the tribe of Reuben holds zero validity. Now, in order to lay claim that this demographic is Reuben, they typically bring up the Seminole Wars, a series of 3 major battles that ultimately culminated in the defeat and subjugation of the Seminole tribe. They also bring up how the Seminoles were the only tribe to stand up to American colonists, and are therefore the first sign of Jacob's strength, dignity, and power. This is definitely one of the more outlandish claims they've made, as there are far too many holes in this hypothesis. The first being that the Seminoles by far were not the first projection or sign of indigenous strength and power in the sight of the enemy, which this movement claims is the white man. By the time of the Seminole Wars in the 19th century, European colonists had already been met by numerous tribes that posed an equal or greater threat than that of the Seminoles. One example of a far earlier and more fitting match as the first sign of indigenous strength, dignity, and power is the Chichimeca tribe. Chichimeca military strikes against the Spanish included raidings, ambushing critical economic routes, and pillaging. In the long-running Chichimeca War from 1550 to 1590, the Spanish initially attempted to defeat the combined Chichimeca peoples in a war of fire and blood, but eventually sought peace as they were unable to defeat them. The Chichimeca small-scale raids proved effective. To end the war, the Spanish adopted a purchase for peace program by providing foods, tools, livestock, and land to the Chichimecas, sending Spaniards to teach them agriculture, and by passively converting them to Catholicism. Essentially, this was the first time in the New World that Europeans had been forced to come to terms with indigenous tribes due to an inability to continually battle. This was perhaps the first sign of the natives' deathless courage and unwavering persistence, which showed Europeans that colonizing the Americas would be no easy feat. To add, the fact that Spanish colonists sought relations with these people and established services for them shows that the Spanish respected the Chichimeca and treated them with dignity. Again, showing that they are a closer match to the fulfillment of Reuben's prophecy. Not to mention, this makes them amongst the first Native Americans to convert to Christianity, again proving them to be a much earlier sign of indigenous dignity. When you contrast that with the fact that Seminoles did not even beat the Americans in their preliminary showdowns and had gradually been pushed south until being captured and taken by gunpoint to Oklahoma, it becomes even more evident that Seminoles are not even the best match to Reuben in America, never mind the world. Now, verse 4 of Genesis 49 explains how the Reubenites would be unstable as water and would not excel or retain preeminence. There are many claims that the fact Seminole means wild, untamed, or runaway shows that these titles validate them as an unstable population. Now, I can see how somebody can be fooled by this interpretation, but when you consider the context behind this instability, it becomes evident that this is a false parallel. See, the rest of the sentence explains how Reuben would not excel, as a punishment for his sexually immoral act with his father's concubine, Zilpah. 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 1 states, "Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but for as much as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given unto the son of Joseph, the son of Israel, and the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright." So with that in mind, verse 4 isn't calling Reuben unstable in the sense that he is wild, untamed, or a runaway. Matter of fact, he is the complete opposite, as Genesis 49 claims he is a sign of dignity and power. Keep in mind that holding the birthright of Israel means building and expanding one's dominion, as the Israelites are promised to spread across and inherit the entirety of the earth. This completely negates the Reubenites as being wild, untamed runaways. For this reason, a more accurate interpretation of Genesis 49 verse 4 would be that Reuben's grasp on control and power would be unstable, and that there would be great political discourse amongst this tribe. Essentially, after showing up as the first sign of strength, dignity, and power, Reuben's dominion will wane, therefore causing him to eventually lose preeminence to the second in line, which is Joseph. Therefore, if the Seminoles were the fulfillment of this prophecy, they would have been passing their power off to another indigenous tribe upon being subjugated and brought to Oklahoma. That said, there was no passing of authority or dominance once the Seminoles were defeated and subjugated. In fact, it was the Americans who obtained that power, and we will later see how this actually ties into the true fulfillment of the passing of Reuben's birthright. But for now, let's focus on the more ancient fulfillments of Reuben's prophecies, and gradually work our way up to the passing of his birthright. Now, the answer of who Reuben truly is nowhere near as simple as the Black Hebrew Israelites make it out to be. Reason being that upon the Israelites' dispersal from Assyria, these tribes mixed and amalgamated amongst one another as well as their Japhetic cousins. It can only be speculated that by the will of our Creator, these Israelites gradually end up mixing amongst their Israelite tribal kin and forming dominance within their own specific territories. Black Hebrew Israelites don't seem to understand that there were numerous factions of Reuben, each being traced to different migrations out of Egypt, the Levant, and Scythia, and that there have been multiple fulfillments of the same prophecy by the same lineages, but in different periods of time. Unfortunately, due to the isolationist stance modern academia leans towards, it would be argued that these groups were completely separate with no genetic or cultural affinities. But as I've mentioned in numerous videos before, both Celtic and Germanic tribes are of Indo-European descent and share a common ancestry linking back to the Scythians, which was essentially a blanket term for a collection of Aryan tribes amalgamated around the Caucasus, Black Sea, Eastern Europe, and Western Asia. As I've mentioned before, these populations were originally Japhetic. But with the dispersal of captive northern Israelites, the Semitic portion eventually came to rule over them. These Israelite Scythians came to be known as the Royal Scyths or the Germani, which in Latin actually means genuine, of the same two parents. Later on, we will see how this ties into the Rhesus Negative bloodline and validates the Germani, or genuine Scyths, as being of pure Adamic lineage. From 700 BC onwards, any mention you hear of Scythians is a mention of Israelites. It is important to distinguish these Scythians from groups like the Sarmatians, who had gradually intermixed with Asian and Arabic demographics, ultimately diluting their Indo-European bloodline. On the other hand, those of genuine stock ultimately become known as Germani or Germanics.
So, as we slowly move west into Europe, pushed at times by Rome, at times by population growth, at times by incursions of both foreign and brother peoples from the east, in a domino effect, the Scythians, using the broadest definition here, seem to almost seamlessly morph into the Goths, again using the broader definition. Interestingly, Strabo and Pliny the Elder separated the Scythians into two elements, the Sarmati and the Germani, the latter term derived from the Latin Germanus, meaning genuine, of the same parents. Recall in Part 2 where we spoke of the Royal Scythians often being referred to as the genuine Scythians. It may be that the Sarmati were a Scythian element with some foreign admixture, whether racial or cultural or both. Interestingly, the Anglo-Saxons were also known as the Germani. Strabo further refers to a people known as the Celto-Scythi, or the Celtic Scythians. As one writer puts it, if we go back 500 years from the point of when the Teutonic languages began to differentiate, we discover that great swaths of northern, western, and eastern Europeans spoke similar dialects of a common Indo-European language. When scholars try to pin a label on a particular European barbarian tribe, as being Germanic, or Celtic, or Scythian, they often find themselves in a quandary. Distinctions are often unclear and can easily become arbitrary." End quote. It's vital to keep in mind that prior to the bulk of the Goths arriving back into Europe, their German brothers were already present on the land. With the Cimbrian War kicking off the conflict between Roman and Germanic peoples in earnest in approximately 110 BC, and others too giving Julius Caesar a taste of what was to come, as he mentions firsthand in his work The Commentaries on the Gallic War. Almost from the start, there was a relationship of mutual respect, at least with regards to martial capabilities. And the Romans, too, held to one of the longest traditions across all Indo-European societies in employing almost exclusively Scythian and Germanic peoples in the personal bodyguard of the leadership, in this case the Roman Emperor, a hand-picked elite cadre of men chosen for both fighting merit and an unshakable sense of loyalty and honor. The Praetorian, or Varangian, or Swiss Guard units are just a few examples of this long-standing custom. A custom which I personally believe originated with the Royal Scythians, as a means to protect royal lineages. Tacitus gives us the best account of the ancient Germans in their natural state, and I highly recommend his works, especially Germania, for those seeking additional context. He's not merely a brilliant man, but seems to possess an especially healthy and well-oriented mind, coupled with judgment and foresight to see many things that those around him seem to miss. I've linked his audiobook below for those interested, but to cover a few interesting excerpts, he speaks of the German name being a fairly recent invention and a misnomer, a Roman interpretation of the name of a single tribe, which they then lazily applied to all of the scattered tribes. He speaks of ancient songs and bards being the mechanism for passing down history and stories, and mirroring the Scythian legends, quote, "They say that Hercules too once visited them, and when going into battle they sing of him first of all heroes," and speaks of the infamous war chants they employed. Ulysses, too, was spoken of as having visited and founded an ancient town, and Tacitus speaks of a shrine of him containing Greek inscriptions still existing on the borders of Germany. Their kings were chosen by birth, their generals by merit. Neither had unlimited power, and they led by personal example. Quote, "The very prestige of a chief may settle a war," end quote. And it was considered a disgrace for a chief to be surpassed in valor, and infamy to have survived a battle in which one's chief had died, which I believe hints at one of the many reasons why the Germans were so highly sought in the Praetorian and Varangian and all similar royal bodyguard units. Their squadrons of fighting men weren't formed by chance, he says, no doubt contrasting Rome's mercenary structure, but composed of families and clans, meaning they'd always fight alongside brothers and kin, and be encouraged to have their wounds tended to by women who were wives or relatives. Like so many other Indo-European peoples, they seem to place the highest value on maidens of noble birth. After all, a man is technically capable of passing his genetic lineage down to hundreds, even thousands of descendants, in the manner of a Genghis Khan, or perhaps even Heracles. So it's the woman who is the key component in this regard. He speaks of the style of dress as cloaks fastened with a clasp, or with skin-fitting clothing made from wild beasts, and speaks of the inner tribes as dressing better. Their diet was largely composed of wild fruit and fresh game and curdled milk. Similar to all other writers, he speaks very highly of their sense of, and customs with regards to, justice. Crimes were to be exposed and punished. Infamy was to be buried out of sight. Good habits, he says, were more effectual than good laws elsewhere. He speaks of them as a race with no natural cunning, and regarding their trade and barter, the vitally important line, "Of interest they know nothing," and says no nation is more hospitable, and it was their custom to give and receive freely, feeling no obligation from either action. Like the Spartans and Scythians and so many other related peoples, each individual, in a rite of passage, must earn their arms, and abandoning one's shield was considered the basest action, resulting in shunning. They considered it, quote, "tame and stupid to acquire by immense toil what they might win by courage, valor, or blood, and didn't well tolerate close quarters with regards to living spaces, but spread out freely to whatever areas attracted them." They often indulged in what he calls games of hazard, sparring and warlike contests, sometimes wagering their own freedom, and in exceptional cases even their lives, in the competitions. And with regards to slavery, the type practiced by those Tacitus observed was very different from that we are accustomed to. Each, quote, "slave" was given a house of their own, and acted as indentured servants, required to give a certain amount of produce periodically. Each tribe seems to have created its own niche culture within the larger framework. One of the more intriguing descriptions of a wilder tribe on the borderlands is as follows, quote, "The Hari, besides being superior in strength to the tribes just enumerated, savage as they are, make the most of their natural ferocity by the help of art and opportunity. Their shields are black, their bodies dyed. They choose dark nights for battle, and, by the dread and gloomy aspect of their death-like host, strike terror into the foe, who can never confront their strange and almost infernal appearance. For in all battles it is the eye which is first vanquished." End quote. In another description, he speaks of the Cimbri, likely descendants of the Cimmerians. Quote, "In the same remote corner of Germany, bordering on the ocean, dwell the Cimbri, a now insignificant tribe, but of great renown. Of their ancient glory widespread traces yet remain. On both sides of the Rhine are encampments of vast extent, and by their circuit you may even now measure the warlike strength of the tribe, and find evidence of that mighty immigration. Rome was in her 640th year when we first heard of the Cimbrian invader, in the consulship of Caelius Metellus and Papirius Carbo, from which time to the second consulship of the Emperor Trajan we have to reckon about 210 years. So long have we been in conquering Germany. In the space of this long epoch, many losses have been sustained on both sides. Neither Samnite, nor Carthaginian, nor Spain, nor Gaul, not even the Parthians have given us more frequent warnings. German independence truly is fiercer than the despotism of an Narcissus. Germans, by routing or making prisoners of Carbo, Cassius, Scarus Aurelius, Servilius Capio, Marcus Manlius, deprived the Roman people of 5 consular armies, and they robbed even a Caesar of Varus and his 3 legions. They stormed the winter camp of our legions and even designed the conquest of Gaul. May the tribes, I pray, ever retain, if not the love for us, at least the hatred for each other." End quote. One of the many reasons Tacitus has not been given due credit in our times is due to a single statement that to this day drives the politically correct mindset into a frenzy. Quote, "For my own part, I agree with those who think that the tribes of Germany are free from all taint of intermarriages with foreign nations, and they appear as a distinct, unmixed race like none but themselves. Hence, too, the same physical peculiarities through so vast a population." End quote. Now, keep in mind he's referencing a large group of people here, not a nation, as Germany itself didn't exist as a nation until very recently. Also keep in mind as you witness modern academics trip over themselves to dismiss these words in any and every novel manner they can dream up. Here was one of the best minds of his age, sober and prudent, who had perhaps more experience with the varied races of humanity, and every possible mixture among them, due to his observing both Germania and the increasingly multicultural empire of Rome, than any of his peers, stating this opinion with definitive confidence. So, let's take a moment to speak to the Goths, specifically, as defined by those who saw them in their most narrow and specific form. First, the name. The Grimm brothers, noted as great historical minds in addition to being masterful authors, believe the term Goth to be closely connected to the German Gott, meaning God. Others have suggested the term meant nobly born, and there's an obvious connection to the root gut, meaning good. I tend to think that there's likely a grain of truth to most of these connections, directly or indirectly. Second, as to the physical description, the historian Henry Bradley sums up the almost universal description with, quote, "Goths are always described as tall and athletic men with fair complexions, blue eyes and yellow hair. Such people as in fact might be seen more frequently in Sweden than in any other land." End quote. And the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan would later describe the Viking Rus, likely the most direct outgrowth of the Gothic peoples as they came to be known under different names, by saying, quote, "Never before have I seen people of more perfect physique. They were tall like palm trees, blonde, with a few of them red. They do not wear any jackets or kaftanir, robes. The men instead wear dress which covers one side of the body but leaves one hand free. Every one of them brings with him an axe, a sword, and a knife." End quote. Third, as to their general personality and manner of being, the historian Bradley continues, quote, "That the Gothic people had many noble qualities was frequently acknowledged, even by their enemies, and it is abundantly proved by many incidents in their history. They were brave, generous, patient under hardship and privation, and chaste and affectionate in their family relations." End quote. And then continues with an interesting aside that despite their history of achievement and successes, I too have come to agree with. Quote, "There is nothing in their history more remarkable than the humanity and justice which they exercised towards the nations whom they conquered." End quote. He goes on to state that this was recognized by their foes, who often went so far as to welcome their appearance on the scene as liberators. In a remarkably objective quip, a Roman named Salvian, an ecclesiastic of Marseille, stated, "There is one consenting prayer among the Roman population, that they might dwell under their barbarian government." Thus our brethren not only refuse to leave these nations for their own, but they fly from us to them. Can we then wonder that the Goths are not conquered by us, when the people would rather become Goths with them than Romans with us? End quote. Fourth, with regards to their belief structure, I've always loved this snippet by Tacitus, which I believe to be fundamental in importance. Quote, "The Germans, however, do not consider it consistent for the grandeur of celestial beings to confine the gods within walls, or to liken them to the form of any human countenance. They consecrate woods and groves, and they apply the names of deities to the abstraction which they see only in spiritual worship." End quote. To me, this meaning is clear. The capital G God, creator of all things, was something beyond direct human understanding or quantification, and certainly beyond the ability for fallible human minds or hands to create in the form of idols to then be worshipped. Nature, in the form of sacred groves, was the closest proxy. They certainly practiced a veneration of ancestors, bordering on a form of worship, and held in extremely high esteem both Hercules and the archetype of Tiwaz or Tyre, also known as Ares to the Greeks, Mars to the Romans, who they saw as the personification of war, law, and justice simultaneously. Odin as well, and Freya. There's a great deal more to be said on the subject, but I couldn't hope to do it justice here, so I'll leave it at this for now, after a few more words about the concept of ancestor veneration. Edred Thorson states that the Gothic families maintained secret traditions stretching back to the time of their origins. Quote, "It is these sources which account for their success and the immortality of their name. These traditions hinged on the continuing secret cult of divine ancestry, the hidden cult of the Anses. The formula of divine ancestry must be understood in both its parts. First, the idea is that there is a divine, immortal, perfect, and wise component or element or substance, which is not bound by time or place. This transcends the mundane world, stands above it. Second is the idea that this substance can be transmitted or transferred from person to person, or from generation to generation, through historical time and over natural space. We know that this ancestral portion could be transmitted genetically through the blood, or through symbolic initiations, blood brotherhood, adoption, reception into warrior bands, guilds, etc. Although these latter methods were well known to the pagans and well documented among them, it appears that under the influence of the Christian tradition of apostolic succession, these later methods grew to be more and more prestigious over the centuries. This increasingly became the method whereby the threatened esoteric of the Goths could be secretly transmitted, and thus protected from an ever more hostile world." End quote. And with regards to Christianity, the evidence seems to contradict the popular notion many still hold, that all Germanic peoples were dragged kicking and screaming into a new religious conception, or forced at the point of a sword. In fact, the very first book written in the Gothic language was a translation of the Bible, penned by a man the emperor dubbed our second Moses, a Gothic Cappadocian named Wulfila, literally transcribed as Little Wolf in the 3rd century AD. Now, of course, this wasn't modern Christianity, much of which seems to have been subverted into something of an extension of the very worldly social justice movement, but rather a much more strict and true-to-form conception. The bigger leap didn't seem to be to Christianity, whose central focus on a self-sacrificing figure bore some resemblance to Odin, who was hung on a tree and in some stories pierced by a spear. The more difficult leap was rather to Catholicism, as opposed to that Arian form of Christianity, which was more familiar and comfortable to them. and that didn't require they bend the knee to priests and churches of Rome. The Franks, the Germanic people largely responsible for the creation of France as we know it today, acting as Rome's first and strongest allies willing to adopt Catholicism, were in some sense tasked with its spread across all German lands, a difficult and bloody transition, in part planting the seeds of the Protestant and Catholic conflicts of later eras. It's also deeply interesting that the Goths and Norse were referred to as the Magi during the Visigothic period in Spain, with the non-Gothic elements making no distinction between them and the Magi of Zoroastrian Persian fame, a term you might recognize in part from the three wise men of the biblical tradition. Rome, especially the Eastern Roman Empire under Justinian, would begin to exploit this Catholic and Arian rift as a means of establishing greater control over the Goths, or attempting to destroy those he couldn't control. A hallmark trait of the Germanic people seems to be an unwillingness to bow to any form of centralized authority that doesn't spring from their own roots. A lesson foreign rulers would need to learn and relearn several times throughout history, often at the point of an extremely proficient sword. We'll discuss this and get to know the Gothic people through an examination of their dynamic with Rome, the Huns, the Jews, and the Saracens in the next installment in our series, which I hope to release within a week or two from now, and which may be followed by a third video shortly after, as it's simply impossible to condense this story into a single hour. We'll also be introduced to some of the most exceptional and impressive figures in human history, figures modern history books seem to give scant reference to, if any, yet who by any objective standard towered over their peers, and encapsulate the essence of the Gothic spirit, and who would proceed to lay the groundwork for Gothic dominance of the Roman Empire, all of Europe, stretching east to the Black Sea, even North Africa, and then planting the seed that would one day grow into modern Russia. So, until then.
Now, of all tribes that stem from this Indo-European parent group, there are three in particular that seem to carry relatively larger portions of Reuben. These are the Gauls, Visigoths, and the Franks. Though it's important to mention that both Visigoths and Franks both carry high traces of the tribe of Dan as well. The first of these groups to fulfill the prophecy of Reuben as the first sign of strength, dignity, and power were the Gauls or Galatians.
Now, even during the Persian period, the Israelites were migrating into Europe in larger and larger numbers, and they began using a new name, Scythians, for themselves. And the Greeks also had a new name for them, Galatae. Now, Scythians is derived from the Hebrew word Sukkoth, which means tent dwellers. As the historian Herodotus explains, at this time our ancestors had no permanent cities, but lived constantly on the move, with the women and children in wagons, and the men on horseback with bows and arrows. As for the Greek name Galatae, the ancient historian Homer mocked the Scythians, calling them galactophagi, meaning milk-fed. It is likely that Galatae originates from milk drinkers, as Gala in Greek means milk. Our ancestors survived on the meat and milk of their cattle. Eventually, by 390 BC, the Galatae had invaded Italy and went on to sack Rome. The Romans shortened the name Galatae to just Galli, which we anglicized to Gauls. The Roman historian Livy calls the Gauls at this time a strange race, new settlers, as the Romans had never before seen these people because they were newcomers to Europe. The Gauls pushed even further west into Europe, and some settled in what was already called Celtica, or France today, and mingled with the Celts. The land was renamed to Gaul.
Interestingly, the Hebrew word for captives is galuth, and the term for exile is galah. In other words, the Gauls descended from those Israelite tribes taken into captivity and sent into exile. Gaul also bears an etymological link to milk-fed, and the Gauls were known for their high consumption of dairy, which was a staple of Israelite, and more specifically Reubenite, diet. As I've mentioned in my video on the lost tribe of Gad, both him and Reuben chose to settle in the land of Gilead due to the fact that it was suitable for their livestock. More than 85% of Indo-Europeans are lactose persistent, whereas 75 to 95% of Africans, Asians, and indigenous are lactose intolerant as adults. So it makes sense that a group of Indo-European descent would be known for their consumption of dairy, and would be considered a group separated from others. Now, most people believe the Gauls are of Edomite descent since they were primarily red-haired and arose shortly prior to the Germans. However, keep in mind that they were amongst the first tribes taken into captivity, as mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 26. So it makes sense that they're also the first to emerge post-captivity, becoming known as the Gauls and Galatians. Unfortunately, this parallel is heavily ignored by most researchers, as people lazily draw connections to Esau. In fact, if you watch my most recent video on Rh negatives and the R1b Haplogroup, you will hear my explanation as to how both Jacob and Esau's descendants carried the MC1R gene, which is responsible for reddish skin and hair tones, or in other words, ruddy phenotypes. Now, upon seizing Gilead, Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III established the province of Gal-Azu. Furthermore, the Hellenistic and Roman conquerors later renamed the area of Gilead to Gaul-Anitis. So not only were the Gauls etymologically linked to Israelites through Hebrew terms like captive and exiled, but the term Gaul itself had been linked to the ancient land of Gilead, home of the tribe of Reuben. Gaul also has an etymological link to the Greek term for dairy, which is also indicative of Reubenite descent since he chose the land of Gilead for his livestock. Now, to the Celts themselves, the words Gael and Sith both meant stranger or traveler. One example of this word's use is applied to Egyptian princess Skoda, who is said to have been the mythological founder of Scotland and wife of a Scythian king from Greece. Her name also meant wandering queen, implying she came from afar. Now, when it comes to the Siths, keep in mind that God had told the northern Israelite tribes that they would become wanderers in Hosea 9 verse 17. This even further corroborates the connection between Gauls, Gaels, Scythians, and the lost tribes of Israel. And to mention quickly, if you haven't read the Scottish Declaration of Our Growth, it is a must, because you'll hear from our ancestors themselves that we descend from Greater Scythia. But with all that said, the ties between Gauls and the tribe of Reuben don't end there.
Paul's letters were to Europeans and Europeans only. Of all the apostles, Paul was personally chosen by Christ to spread the gospel to the dispersed children of Israel in Europe. Paul's mission was revealed in Acts chapter 9, where it is revealed that Paul is a chosen vessel by Christ to bear his name before the nations and kings of the sons of Israel. Now, generally this verse is often mistranslated to the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel, as though Paul was being sent to 3 separate groups. We'll cover more about mistranslations in a later proof, but once the mistranslation is corrected, we see that Paul was sent to the nations and kings of the sons of Israel. In other words, he was sent to the dispersed Israelites. Paul wrote 8 general epistles and 4 epistles to various individuals. For the general epistles, they are addressed to the Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, and Hebrews. All of these people, except for the Hebrews, were located in Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor, so it's clear that Paul was only interested in spreading the gospel to the European people because that's where he believed the dispersed Israelites were. Paul explains to the Galatians that they were once under the law, therefore they must have been Israelites, and that it had been a tutor for Christ. The Galatians were Gauls who had migrated back to Anatolia Italia, so all related to the Germanic tribes. If Paul identifies the Galatians as Israelites, then all the Germanic tribes must also be Israelites.
Many of us know that from 51 to 57 AD, the Apostle Paul made multiple missionary trips to the Galatians. The name of Galatia is derived from the 20,000 Gauls who settled in this region in 278 BC. More than 2 centuries later, in 25 BC, the area became a Roman province and was extended to the south. In Paul's day, the new province included the regions of Pisidia, Phrygia, and Laconia. Scholars often refer to these new southern regions as South Galatia, and to geographic Galatia as North Galatia. Yet, recent archaeological discoveries suggest that Galatia extended even further south during the 1st century CE. Understand that through the conversion of Gauls to Christianity, they were called to rid themselves of their pagan beliefs and represent Christianity. This makes them amongst the first heathens to convert and validates them as the first sign of Jacob's dignity amongst these barbarian demographics. That said, Reuben is also a sign of strength and power, so how exactly did the Gauls fulfill this part of the prophecy? Well, as we know, by the time of Babylon's fall, the world's largest superpower on earth was Rome. For over 3 centuries, they prospered and established themselves as one of the greatest civilizations to ever exist. They were a colonial power who dominated their enemies from post to post. But around the 4th century BC, all of that started to change, as the emergence of Celtic and Germanic tribes, referred to as barbarians, marked the beginning of Rome's decline and demise. The first people in history to successfully sack and defeat Rome were the Gauls in 390 BC. What's interesting about the Gauls is that their hold on power was extremely unstable and only lasted a few years. Following Rome's reacquisition of territory, the Gauls remained fragmented and split for over 300 years. That is, until the reign of Vercingetorix, who lived from 82 to 46 BC. He was a Gallic chieftain who rallied the tribes of Gaul to repel the Roman invasion of Julius Caesar. His name means victor of 100 battles, and was not his birth name, but a title, and the only name he is known by. This is even more evidence linking the Gauls to Reuben, as they were a strong and powerful demographic, but a lack of unity and indecision persisted for centuries to come, ultimately validating them as an unstable tribe. Nonetheless, they struck fear in the hearts of the Roman people, who saw them as their greatest threat. So with that said, let's get into some descriptions of the Celts, and more specifically, the Gauls. Of the Celts, Sicilian historian Diodorus states, their aspect is terrifying. They are very tall in stature, with rippling muscles under clear white skin. Now, if you've watched my video on Rhesus Negative Israelites, as well as the tribe of Judah identified, you'd know that clear white skin is a trait of Rhesus negative blood, and that the R1b Haplogroup was responsible for 30% of the difference in skin tone between white and black populations. You'd also see that there's clear indications of Israelites having white skin, so I suggest you watch those videos. But to carry on, Diodorus states, the Celts wear bronze helmets with figures picked out on them, even horns, which made them look even taller than they already are, while others cover themselves with breast armor made of chains. But most content themselves with the weapons nature gave them. They go naked into battle. Weird, discordant horns were sounded. They shouted in chorus with their deep and harsh voices. They beat their swords rhythmically against their shields. Now when it comes to the Gauls, Ammianus Marcellinus of the 4th century AD quotes the Gauls as being tall of stature, fair and ruddy, terrible for the fierceness of their eyes. Of course, those videos I just brought up also explain how both the Scythians and Israelites also fit this description. Another historian named Arrian from the 1st century AD states that they are people of great stature and haughty disposition. Strabo of the 1st century quotes them as being a whole nation madly fond of war, both highly spirited and ready for battle, and on whatever pretext you stir them, you will have them ready to face danger, even if they have nothing on their side but their own strength and courage. In terms of appearance, Virgil of the 1st century states, "Golden is their hair, and golden their garb. They are resplendent in their striped cloaks, and their milk-white necks are circled with gold." Of course, there's another biblical figure who also has a milk-white neck, though it's rather mentioned as being white as ivory. This is King Solomon, who also had blue eyes, the colors of the pools at Gesbon. Now quickly, if you saw my last few videos, you would know that Rome carries Israelite descent through both Judah and Dan. It's for this reason that you may be asking why the Gauls would be attacking their Israelite brothers, and how this can be deemed a righteous action on behalf of Reuben. Well, though Rome was settled by Zerah Judahites fleeing Troy, not all Romans were of this lineage. There were also Danites, while also many others descended from Canaanites, Assyrians, Babylonians, etc. Essentially, though it was likely a Zerahite who sat on the Roman throne, it was the Danites who dictated Rome's stance on an international and political scale. Remember, the name Dan means to judge, and when pairing that with the fact that Dan will be contending with his brothers for dominance, we have an indication that Danites would probably have terrible foreign policy. Of course, when considering this tribe's Genesis 49 prophecy, it becomes evident that they would be a serpent in the path, biting the horse's heel, causing its rider to fall back. And what did Rome do? Tread on and oppress the so-called barbarians, who were indeed descended from the exiled northern Israelites. Not to mention, there would be a strong Canaanite, Assyrian, and Babylonian aspect to Rome as well, further pitting them against the sons of Israel. So not only can the Gauls be considered the first sign of Jacob's dignity, as they were the first Israelites to convert to Christianity and reconnect with Yahweh, but they can also be seen as the first sign of his strength and power, as they accomplished what no other demographic on earth was able to, which is defeat their Roman oppressors. That said, just as their forefather Jacob prophesied, they were unstable and eventually lost preeminence, with the Romans recovering dominion shortly afterwards and setting their eyes on the conquest of Gaul. Now you may be asking, where did the birthright go at this point? Was it passed to the Romans? Well, no. The birthright had still not been passed, as from this point on, another group of Reubenites who are amalgamated amongst the Gothic tribe would rise to prominence. The Goths were a Germanic tribe who traced their origins back to Scythia and the Black Sea. Those of you who have been keeping up with my content will know that of all Germanic tribes, the Goths are most representative of Scythian heritage and customs. The Goths were amongst those of royal Scythian descent, and dwelled around the Black Sea near the river Siret for centuries, ultimately fulfilling 2 Ezra's 13 verse 45. Reason being that in the Germanic language, the river Siret was and still is called Sareth till this day, and is known as an area in which Scythian tribes amalgamated and settled beginning in the Iron Age. This was a land flowing with milk and honey, two agricultural products that the Scythians were known to live off. Not to mention, the Bible describes Arzareth as being exactly a year-and-a-half journey beyond the Euphrates. Now yes, it only takes 18 days to walk from Iraq to Romania, but consider mass migrations of nomadic peoples, often pitching tents to camp for short periods. Now, over 700 years after the Gallic sack of Rome, it would again be invaded at the hands of Alaric the First and his Visigoths, who had set out on another mass migration westwards. This was by far the largest blow ever dealt to Rome, and was not a mere sacking of the city, but a conquering of it. Haplogroups is an incredible content creator who has gone in depth on the Goths, and I would love to show some portions of his work, explaining why the Goths are a perfect embodiment of Jacob's strength, dignity, and power.
As we turn our focus on the dynamic between the Roman and Gothic peoples, the subversive nature of post-World War II history becomes most evident. The picture of an all-powerful, civilized Rome annoyed by Goths in the manner that one might be bothered by a mosquito they might swat at any moment is absurd. In fact, even Roman sources admit that were it not for the tactful diplomacy that kept Germanic peoples expending energy in their traditional war games with one another, Rome would have ceased to exist at any moment the united barbarian elements chose to make it so. And the truth is even more extreme. Even while warring among one another, the Goths were still able, on several occasions, to militarily dominate Rome, both on offense and defense. This isn't meant to diminish Roman achievements, skill, or discipline, a nation with justly admired armies, tactics, and leadership, but when viewed objectively, Rome, and especially late Rome, seems a bit more like a corporate construct running on pure ambition, seeking world domination by any means necessary, and gladly making use of any caliber of humanity in pursuit of this goal. Over time, they were to learn many lessons, incorporate this knowledge into their formations and equipment and tactics and strategy, and this counted for much. Coupled with a seemingly unlimited pool of manpower to draw from, one might wonder why they didn't conquer the entire world after all. The answer to this question is very simple and very clear: the Germanic peoples. The more one digs into the true relationship between these two major powers, although two is hardly technically correct here due to the permanently fractured nature of the Germanic peoples, the more it looks as if the Gothic mindset was something akin to, "That's a cute little human domestication experiment you have going on there. You're welcome to do as you wish. In fact, we'll even extend an olive branch to make common cause. Just don't cross us." But alas, the Romans did cross them, several times and in egregious ways. A perfect example of this treachery and its consequences, and one of the numerous stories of such important power that it's a wonder we haven't all heard it, involves the Gothic leader named Fritigern. Having brokered a deal with the Emperor of Rome in 376 AD to essentially ally the two peoples, and move a large contingent of Goths into Roman borders, a mutually beneficial agreement which would give the Germans additional living space and a closer relationship with Rome, and provide Rome with a ready-made source of the highest quality soldiers and military officers, and provide both parties with an alliance against the encroachment of peoples from the east, he began to move his Goths westward, anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000, depending on the source one chooses to trust. The impressive terms the emperor had offered soon proved to be largely empty promises, and serious famine began to spread, becoming so bad that many Germans began dealing with the most shamelessly greedy of Roman traders, with stories of desperate families going so far as to sell one child into Roman servitude to provide just enough food for the other, or simply in order to save their lives. Starvation was rampant. Noticing the increasing anger, the emperor decided to relocate them in an area in which they could more easily be monitored and controlled. There are two prominent accounts of what happened next, both speaking highly of Fritigern's heroism, and in fact both may be true. The first mentions how he'd long sought to quell the tempers of his own Goths and preserve the peace, yet simultaneously had made preparations for the worst, ensuring, quote, "the Goths would be ready to rise as one man should the occasion arise," end quote. And when invited to a feast by a Roman general, some of his near-starving Gothic troops became enraged at the sight of a fully stocked marketplace, in which they were prevented from buying goods, and got in a fight with and killed some Romans. The Roman general, roused from a drunken slumber, ordered the slaughter of all Fritigern's men. Fritigern, the historian Bradley states, quote, "In a calm and collective stroke of genius, announced it was needful for him to show himself to his countrymen to put a stop to the tumult," end quote, and simply walked out with his men, as the Romans looked on, stunned, unsure of how to respond. In the second account, Jordanus states, and I quote, "Now it came to pass, in that troublous time, that Lupicmus, the Roman general, invited Fritigern, a chieftain of the Goths, to a feast, and, as the event revealed, devised a plot against him. But Fritigern, thinking no evil, came to the feast with a few followers. While he was dining in the praetorium, he heard the dying cries of his ill-fated men. For, by order of the general, the soldiers were slaying his companions, who were shut up in another part of the house. The loud cries of the dying fell upon ears already suspicious, and Fritigern at once perceived the treacherous trick. He drew his sword, and with great courage dashed quickly from the banqueting hall, rescued his men from their threatening doom, and incited them to slay the Romans. Thus these valiant men gained the chance they had longed for, to be free to die in battle rather than perish of hunger, and immediately took arms to kill the generals Lupicinus and Maximus. Thus that day put an end to the famine of the Goths, and the safety of the Romans, for the Goths, no longer as strangers and pilgrims, but as citizens and lords, began to rule the inhabitants, and to hold in their own right all of the northern colony as far as the Danube. When the Emperor Valens heard of this at Antioch, he made ready an army at once, and set out for the country of Thrace. Here a grievous battle took place, and the Goths prevailed. The emperor himself was wounded and fled to a farm near Adrianople. The Goths, not knowing that an emperor lay hidden in so poor a hut, set fire to it, as is customary in dealing with a cruel foe, and thus he was cremated in royal splendor. From this time the Visigoths, in consequence of their glorious victory, possessed Thrace and Dacia Ripensis as if it were their native land." End quote. This type of famine, in this case caused by either Roman treachery or incompetence, was exceptional. And here we should quickly clear up another major misconception about the Germanic peoples. In most video documentaries on the ancient Germans, you'll see a disorderly gaggle of men who look like they've been cast to portray over-the-top caricatures of white trashy savages, often obese, disheveled, as if they've spent hours smearing their entire bodies in dirt, wearing equally dirty, tattered rags, waving weapons in the air like they've never held one in their lifetimes, with faces usually twisted in their best attempt at expressions of fierceness or rage, poor posture, looking generally unhealthy and mentally dull, and the impression we're given in videos and textbooks is that these men lived short, brutish, miserable lives. This is very much the opposite of what the fact picture seems to indicate. Keep in mind that, like the later Vikings, because these were unparalleled warriors that could demand tribute from virtually any empire at any time, and often did so, they were likely the wealthiest people in the world in a per capita context, with Rome itself paying them vast sums of treasure regularly. Not only has an astonishingly high level of Gothic medical technology recently been unearthed in places like Constantinople, but several accounts report men living to ripe old ages. Hermanric, described as the Gothic Alexander, who at one point, quote, ruled all the nations of Scythia and Germania as they were his own, lived to 110, and there are stories of leaders taking or holding their positions of power well into their 80s. But it's far more than lifespan. Consider how these men lived. It's recently been discovered that their teeth were far healthier than the picture that's always been painted, with the lack of processed foods and refined sugars not having a chance to take their toll. Their water wasn't laden with the chemical stew we face today. Their diet was as healthy and natural as it gets, and of course heavy on protein, and they spent their entire day, if not lounging or drinking by the fire, in the hunt, or in games of sport, or in warfare, or the training for warfare. Our modern epidemics of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, etc. didn't exist. Yes, many met their deaths on the battlefield in their prime, but I suspect the average man was far, far healthier than the average man today. They were also objectively larger and stronger than those around them, a trait that seems to have been passed down through the ages, as illustrated by a glance at the percentages of strongman competition winners hailing from Germanic nations, especially Scandinavia.
Now the champion, the man with a built-in megaphone, John Paul Sigmarsson.
Of Iceland!
Some very brave person in the crowd has actually called him an Eskimo, and he's heard that remark all right.
I'm not an Eskimo, I'm a Viking!
If he hadn't been engaged in something else, you might have put the record straight another way. But to the matter in hand, a small matter of 495 kilos. Or the definitive look of triumph.
And on this topic, there's another fascinating story about Maximin, a man of humble background who would eventually become emperor through accomplishment and merit alone. A Gothic Thracian, Jordanus tells us, quote, "After his years spent in rustic life, he had come from his flocks to military service in the reign of Emperor Severus, and at the time when the latter was celebrating his son's birthday. It happened that the emperor was giving military games. When Maximin saw this, although he was a semi-barbarian youth, he besought the emperor in his native tongue to give him permission to wrestle with the trained soldiers for the prizes offered. Severus, marveling much at his great size, for his stature, it is said, was more than 8 feet, bade him contend in wrestling with the camp followers, in order that no injury might befall his soldiers at the hands of this wild fellow. Thereupon Maximin threw 16 attendants with so great ease that he conquered them one by one without taking any rest, by pausing between the bouts. So then, when he had won the prizes, he was ordered into the army and served his first campaign with the cavalry. On the 3rd day after this, when the emperor went out to the field, he saw him coursing about in barbarian fashion, and bade a tribune restrain him and teach him Roman discipline. But when he understood that the emperor was speaking about him, he came forward and began to run ahead of him as he rode. Then the emperor spurred on his horse to a slow trot, and wheeled in many a circle hither and thither, with various turns, until he was weary. Then he said to him, "Are you willing to wrestle now after your running, my little Thracian?" "As much as you like, O emperor," he answered. So Severus leapt off his horse and ordered the freshest soldiers to wrestle with him. But he threw to the ground 7 very powerful youths, even as before, taking no breathing space between the bouts. So he alone was given prizes of silver and a golden necklace by Caesar. Then he was bidden to serve in the bodyguard of the emperor. After this he was pronounced to officer, often increasing his fame by his deeds, and rose to many military grades, and finally to the centurionship as a reward for his active service." End quote. So many in positions of leadership in Rome, especially military, were of Germanic extraction. So strong was this trend that the last several centuries of Rome's existence might be seen as a gradual transformation into a Germanic empire, as opposed to the sudden and stark shift many have been led to believe came to pass. The Goths, who in their disunity were pushed ever further westward by the Huns, began to blend into Rome in a sense. Their attitude seemed to be a mixture of respect and wariness, though at times bordering on disgust. They admired many of Rome's achievements, the architecture, the aqueducts, the orderliness and structure, but contrary to the impression modern history paints, they weren't eager to destroy, conquer, or become Rome in any sense. Gothic leaders were to make it clear, time and time again, what they sought was to coexist, ideally in a friendly manner. Yet the Germanic peoples were to essentially sack Rome 4 times in a mere 150 years. At virtually any point in this period, they might have made the choice to become Romans, with their heated floors, their multitude of bread and circuses, their marketplace, but they very consciously chose not to do so. And the long series of hostages taken from German noble families, raised nearly from birth in Rome, yet time and time again choosing to return to their homeland and their people and fight for their causes, speaks to this. On several occasions, Germanic leaders speak openly about the dangers of excessive comforts. When the last emperor to rule both East and Western Rome, Theodosius, died, whom Jordanus called a friend to and lover of the Gothic race, Jordanus speaks of his sons beginning to, quote, ruin both empires by their luxurious living, and to deprive the Goths of their customary tributes. The contempt of the Goths for the Romans soon increased, and, quote, for fear their valor would be destroyed by long peace, they appointed Alaric king over them, end quote. And this is telling. It's not ambitiousness or desire for plunder that seems to drive the Germanic assaults on Rome, but rather reactions to outright treachery, or obvious degeneracy or a lack of health and order in the empire at large. Much like Tacitus, I believe they saw a swift decline of this once great empire, and seemed earnestly to want to salvage aspects of its greatness. Alaric is an impressive figure in Germanic history. In his early battles with Stilicho, a half-German who for a time was the most powerful man in the Western Roman Empire, Alaric broke through Stilicho's lines, marched 30 miles north, and crossed a gulf before Stilicho could even put his troops in order, to surprise him completely. A masterstroke that the historian Bradley states, quote, travelers who are acquainted with the ground say that this march of Alaric's is one of the most amazing feats in the historical record. By the mid-4th century, the Goths within Rome already exercised vast control over the empire via powerful figures like the kingmaker Ricimer, a capable general loved and respected by the troops. Goths outside Rome, meanwhile, had established a very real power base in Toulouse. During the fighting between these two forces, Rome paid a large bribe to Alaric to compel him to retreat. Amusingly, the Romans then celebrated a triumph, treating this as a great victory, and inscribed on an arch that the Gothic nation has been subdued, never to rise again. Words the Goths no doubt read with bemusement as they rode through the streets of the conquered capital a few years later. A revolt of sorts set this ball rolling. In a brief fit of anti-Gothic sentiment, certain Roman citizens, likely spurred on by nefarious actors in their midst, made the grievous error of turning on the Gothic civilians while the Gothic soldiers were stationed elsewhere, and slaughtered their wives and children and looted their property. Approximately 30,000 Gothic soldiers at once deserted the Roman army and joined Alaric, who immediately rode from city to city, effortlessly conquering all in his path. Finally, arriving at Rome, he decided to engage in a siege to starve the town out. The extremely stubborn Romans began to starve to death in great numbers, and yet had the audacity to send a threatening message to Alaric, demanding good terms or else they'd rise up against him in large numbers. It's said that Alaric literally laughed at this, saying, quote, the thicker the grass, the easier it is to mow, end quote, before presenting his terms, namely all of the gold and silver within the walls, and all of the slaves. What should we have left then, was said to be the stunned reply, to which Alaric simply stated, your lives. What makes this additionally amusing is that Alaric seems to have been merely humbling them. Not only did he end up taking far less after they finally capitulated, but it's reported he immediately saw to the end of the starvation, and although it proved impossible to completely restrain the Goths' long built-up anger, he further surprised the conquered population by punishing those that acted most unjustly towards the conquered Romans. Bradley states, quote, Alaric remembered that he was a Christian and tried to use his victory mercifully. He told his soldiers that the plunder of the city was theirs, but that no man was to be killed that was not wearing arms. Even soldiers were to be spared if they took refuge in the holy places, end quote. He then departed to Tuscany, with his army even stronger now, due to a massive number of soldiers within Rome joining his ranks. Alaric could have conquered or destroyed the entire Western Roman Empire with ease at this stage, but he seems to have had no desire to. He wanted a kingdom of his own, alongside and allied to Rome. This was initially agreed to by all local officials, but amazingly, and again audaciously, a stubborn Roman emperor, Honorius, refused the idea, believing himself to be safe and out of harm's way, tucked away in Ravenna. Alaric was furious and promptly marched his army straight away to Ravenna. And what follows is an almost comical series of losses for the Romans under Honorius, who seemed to grow more shamelessly arrogant and headstrong with each successive loss, until finally destroyed completely. No history of the Goths could be complete without a discussion of just how and why they became, out of necessity, so close with Rome, literally and figuratively, both as friend and foe, namely the Huns. It's important to remember that while we tend to see the Romans and Goths as two completely distinct races of peoples, both trace back to the same pivotal figures of legend. For example, their strong connection to the ancient ruling families of and refugees from Troy. The senators and aristocracy in Rome likely had significant overlap with the leading elements of the Gothic world. The intruder culture to their east, however, was something much more foreign. The Huns, likely born from a mixture of Scythian and Asiatic peoples, had exploded in number and had begun constantly harrying and harassing all Germanic peoples on their borders. Jordanus tells a tale, which may be fact or myth or somewhere in between, that speaks of a Scythian and Hun border near the Maeotic swamp, and a hunting party of the Huns chasing a mysterious doe, which they had reason to believe was something exceptional, who guided them into Scythian lands before disappearing. It's said that they were filled with admiration, which quickly gave way to ambition and greed, and after an initial raid in which they looted belongings, sacrificed many Scythians, and made the rest subject to themselves, they decided to make a habit of the behavior. Jordanus says, quote, "Like a whirlwind of nations, they swept across the great swamp, and at once swept upon the tribes on the borders of Scythia. The Alani, who were their equals in battle, but unlike them in civilization, manners, and appearance, they exhausted by their incessant attacks and subdued. For by the tear of their features they inspired great fear in those whom perhaps they did not really surpass in war. They made their foes flee in horror because their swarthy aspect was fearful, and they had, if I may call it so, a sort of shapeless lump, not a head, with pinholes rather than eyes. Their hardihood is evident in their wild appearance, and they are beings who are cruel to their children on the very day they are born, for they cut the cheeks of the males with a sword, so that before they receive the nourishment of milk, they must learn to endure wounds." End quote. Some of the Hunnish habits and tactics and customs were similar to those of the wildest border tribes of the Scythians, and in some sense might even be thought of as a racial or cultural midpoint between the Scythians and the later Mongols of Genghis Khan's era. Evidence seems to indicate that they were the descendants of the Zhongyu, a hybrid Eurasian people who show mixed European and Asiatic admixture at least as far back as 2,000 years ago. Germanic sources would often speak of the Huns in a manner that would be deemed extremely racist today. Yet they always respected courage and military prowess, and still more so, effective leadership. Attila was, by all accounts, a capable leader, extremely courageous, relentlessly energetic, and, although wild and lawless by Gothic standards, not without some virtues and personal code of conduct. Most importantly, he represented the most significant and powerful threat that the Romans and Goths had ever faced, not counting one another. There's a deeply intriguing back and forth that gives us a behind-the-scenes conception of just how deeply this threat was felt, and also serves to illustrate the little-known closeness and camaraderie often felt between the Roman rulership and aristocracy and the Gothic element, likely due at least in part to similar genetic and cultural roots, a similarity probably sensed all the more strongly in the face of these new foreign invaders. Of Illyrian stock himself, Emperor Valentinian sent an embassy to the Visigoths and their king Theodorid with this message. Quote, "Bravest of nations, it is the part of prudence for us to unite against the Lord of the earth who wishes to enslave the whole world, who requires no just cause for battle, but supposes whatever he does is right. He measures his ambition by his might. License satisfies his pride. Despising law and right, he shows himself an enemy to nature herself. And thus he, who clearly is the common foe of each, deserves the hatred of all. Pray remember, what you surely can't forget, that the Huns do not overthrow nations by means of war, where there is an equal chance, but assail them by treachery, which is a greater cause for anxiety. To say nothing of ourselves, can you suffer such insolence to go unpunished? Since you are mighty in arms, give heed to your own danger, and join hands with us in common. Bear aid also to the empire, of which you hold a part. If you would learn how such an alliance should be sought and welcomed by us, look into the plans of the foe. By these and like arguments the ambassadors of Valentinian prevailed upon King Theodorid. He answered them, saying, Romans, you have attained your desires. You have made Attila our foe also. We will pursue him wherever he summons us. And though he is puffed up by his victories over diverse races, yet the Goths know how to fight this haughty foe. I call no war dangerous, save one whose cause is weak, for he fears no ill on whom majesty has smiled. The nobles shouted assent to the reply, and the multitude gladly followed. The Romans knew full well how lucky they were to have not only an ally as a buffer between themselves and the Huns, but an ally who seemed to glory in such conflict, especially when united against an outside force. As the massive host of united Goths under Theodorid took to the field, it said Attila saw his army thrown into confusion and doubt. He sought to encourage them, to steel their nerves, and we have a record of his words that day. Quote, Here you stand, after conquering mighty nations and subduing the world. I therefore think it foolish of me to goad you with words, as though you were men who had not been proved in action. Let a new leader or an untried army resort to that. It is not right for me to say anything common, nor ought you to listen. For what is war but your usual custom? Or what is sweeter for a brave man than to seek revenge with his own hand? It is the right of nature to girt the soul with vengeance. Let us then attack the foe eagerly, for they are ever the bolder who make the attack. Despise this union of discordant races. To defend oneself by alliance is proof of cowardice. See, even before our attack, they are smitten with terror. They seek the heights, they seek the hills, and, repenting too late, clamor for protection against battle in open fields. You know how slight a matter the Roman attack is. While they are still gathering in order and forming in one line with locked shields, they are checked, I will not say by the first wound, but even by the dust of battle. Then on to the fray with stout hearts, as is your wont. Despise their battle line. Attack the Alani, smite the Visigoths. Seek swift victory on that spot where the battle rages. For when the sinews are cut, the limbs soon relax, nor can a body stand when you have taken away the bones. Let your courage rise and your own fury burst forth. Now show your cunning, Huns, now your deeds of arms. Let the wounded exact in return of death his foe. Let the unwounded revel in the slaughter of the enemy. No spear shall harm those who are sure to live, and those who are sure to die, fate overtakes even in peace. And finally, why should fortune have made the Huns victorious over so many nations, unless it were to prepare them for the joy of this conflict? Who was it revealed to our sires the path through the Maeotian swamp, for so many ages a closed secret? Who, moreover, made men yield to you, when you were as yet unarmed? Even a mass of federated nations could not endure the sight of the Huns. I am not deceived in the issue. Here is the field so many victories have promised us. I shall hurl the first spear at the foe. If any can stand at rest while Attila fights, he is a dead man. Inflamed by these words, they all dashed into battle. And although the situation was itself fearful, yet the presence of their king dispelled anxiety and hesitation. Hand to hand they clashed in battle, and the fight grew fierce, confused, monstrous, unrelenting. A fight whose like no ancient time has ever recorded. There such deeds were done that a brave man who missed this marvelous spectacle could not hope to see anything so wonderful all his life long. For if we may believe our elders, a brook flowing between the low banks through the plain was greatly increased by the blood from the wounds of the slain. It was not flooded by showers, as brooks usually rise, but was swollen by a strange stream and turned into this torrent by the increase of blood. In their wretched plight, those whose wounds drove them to slake their parching thirst drank water mingled with gore, the blood they'd poured from their own wounds. At dawn on the following day, when the Romans saw the fields were piled high with bodies, and that the Huns did not venture forth, they thought the victory was theirs. But they knew that Attila would not flee from the battle unless overwhelmed by a great disaster. Yet he did nothing cowardly, like one that is overcome, but with a clash of arms sounded the trumpets and threatened an attack. He was like a lion pierced by hunting spears, who paces to and fro before the mouth of his den and dares not spring, but ceases not to terrify the neighborhood by his roaring. Even so, this warlike king at bay terrified his conquerors. Therefore, the Goths and Romans assembled and considered what to do with the vanquished Attila. They determined to wear him out by a siege, because he had no supply of provisions and was hindered from approaching by a shower of arrows from the bowmen placed within the confines of the Roman camp. But it was said that the king remained supremely brave even in this extremity, and had heaped up a funeral pyre of horse saddles, so that if the enemy should attack him, he was determined to cast himself into the flames, that none might have the joy of wounding him, and that the lord of so many races might not fall into the hands of his foes." End quote. Jordanus follows this up with the story of the battlefield burial and mourning of the dead Gothic king Theodorid, in his unique writing style I find so appealing. Theodorid's son, Thorismund, now took control, and despite the total Gothic victory, was eager to avenge his father's death. Attila was probably surprised when no follow-up attack occurred, but this wasn't to manifest. Later, having gathered his wits and his forces once more, Attila, quote, sought to blot out the fame of his destroyer, and in this way, to annul what he had suffered at the hands of the Visigoths, he met a second defeat and retreated ingloriously, end quote. The united Goths couldn't be stopped, and the Huns would never again seriously threaten Europe. Attila was to die, true to form, after a night of drunken debauchery. Although it's important to mention here, a hallmark feature of the Huns is that they weren't any one thing, but rather a hodgepodge of peoples, even picking up Gothic elements along the way, those earliest tribes they conquered prior to Gothic unity, and forcing them into military service. We also have this from Procopius's History of the Wars, written in the mid-6th century. The Hephthalites, quote, are the stock of the Huns in fact as well as in name. However, they do not mingle with any of the Huns known to us. They are the only ones among the Huns who have white bodies, end quote. So this was not merely a hybrid people, but also a heterogeneous mixture of homogeneous peoples. After Attila's death, several of his sons, mere shadows of their father at best, jockeyed for power, pretending to continue their rule over the lands and peoples, including Goths, as if an inheritance of fiefdoms. The Goths weren't having this, and made quick work of the Huns. Now, ironically, in the same fractured and disunited position that the Goths had been in when the Huns first burst on the scene. As Jordanus so eloquently puts it, they drove them so ingloriously from their own land that those who remained have been in dread of the arms of the Goths from that time down to the present day. Now that the Huns were definitively dealt with, and the Goths had been gifted some newfound unity in the process of carrying out the task, slowly but surely they would go on to become the undisputed masters of all of Europe. And not just Europe, but significant regions of North Africa, and eventually Russia as well, as the Rus, from which it derives its name. This small family of peoples at one point subjugated and provided the ruling caste, if you will, for virtually all of the Western world. France as the Franks, Spain as the Visigoths, Italy and North Africa as the Lombards and Vandals, Britain as the Anglo-Saxons, and of course Germany and Austria, Scandinavia, Poland and Ukraine. It's a well-known but little talked about fact that all of European royalty spread from the seed line of these Germanic peoples. And yet, as was always the case with this group, there was no singular unified empire to speak of, but rather a variety of friendly yet independent branches.
So as we see, not only did the Gauls project strength and power by becoming the first to sack Rome, but were also dignified in being the first of these Israelite branches to accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. Not only that, but the later Visigoths are also a perfect embodiment of traits such as strength, dignity, and power, as they were regarded as such by all who dealt with them, and handed the largest blow to the Roman Empire in history. Now, on the note of Christianity, the first group of barbarians to follow Gauls in converting were actually the Visigoths. That said, it should be noted that they practiced the Arian form of Christianity, in which Christ was not seen as Yahweh's divine son, but a human messenger appointed by him. This is why they aren't officially considered the first Christian Germanic tribe. Nonetheless, they were the first Germanic tribe to accept the Messiah as their Lord and Savior. So it should start becoming evident that both Gauls and Visigoths were the first signs of strength, dignity, and power amongst these so-called barbarian tribes. They were the first to defeat Rome and acted as the catalyst for its collapse, but in doing so did not seek to dominate, subjugate, or oppress the Roman people. Rather, they sought peace, alliance, and reconciliation, as true Israelites should. Ultimately, while the Gauls were the first to sack Rome, the Visigoths were the first to conquer Rome. As time progressed, some factions of Goths remained in Italy, while other portions migrated westwards through France and into Iberia. By 589, the Visigoths of Spain had entirely converted to Christianity. They were a brilliant empire that thrived for centuries and showcased the dominance of Christendom. That is, until the Muslim conquest of Iberia. In 711 AD, an invading force of Arabs and Berbers defeated the Visigoths in the Battle of Guadalete. Visigoth King Roderick and many members of their governing elite were killed, and their kingdom rapidly collapsed. Now, many of you may be asking how this could be the fulfillment of Reuben losing preeminence, as earlier on I mentioned that the birthright was passed to his brother Joseph. Essentially, how on earth could Reuben be Caucasian France and Iberia if Joseph is the Arabic Moors who took their power? Well, again, this was not the passing of Reuben's birthright, but it was him being unstable as the waters. Reason being, there was still a portion of Reubenites back in France known as the Franks. And while the Moors essentially swept through Iberia, the Franks would put an end to their short reign. On the 9th of June 721, Frankish King Otto the Great became the first European monarch to defeat Muslim invaders. He inflicted a major defeat upon Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Qalani at the Battle of Toulouse, the first major battle lost by Muslim Umayyad forces in their military campaign northwards. Like I said, there have been multiple fulfillments of the same prophecy by the same tribe but in different eras. And the same way that Goths were the first sign of strength and power in the sight of Romans or Huns, the Franks were the first sign of strength and power in the sight of Moors. But that's not it when it comes to the Franks fulfilling Reubenite prophecy. See, the Franks are actually where the modern name for France comes from. They would have settled in the northeastern Netherlands as far as the Rhine circa 200 BC. Around the 2nd and 3rd centuries Common Era, they crossed the Rhine and moved into Toxandria, the southern Netherlands, and the German Rhineland. By the 6th century, the Franks had expanded to Lorraine, the Palatinate, and Hesse. Ultimately, the Franks were divided in several tribes, such as the Salian Franks in Flanders and Zeeland, the Mosen Franks in Wallonia, Luxembourg, and Lorraine, and the Ripuari Franks in the Rhineland. The Rhine and Moselle valleys in Germany are still known as Franconia today, and the German dialects within this region are actually varieties of Franconian, which comes from the Old Ripuari language. On the other hand, Old Salian Frankish evolved into Dutch and Flemish dialects. All that said, alternative history has Frankish royal lineages coming out of Troy, ultimately moving through Pannonia and northwards into Germanic Europe.
To give a brief summary of what many historical accounts seem to suggest, it seems that the Romans, Franks, and Goths all sprung from the same root. Though the Goths may have well been the royal Scythians, residing north of the Black Sea, an element that remained aloof in most of the more minor military squabbles, and taking up arms only when the natural order was seriously threatened, the Chronicle of Fredegar and the Liber Historiae Francorum, and the several works both of these documents cite, suggest that both the Romans and Franks were descended from the same group of survivors from Troy. The Chronicle describes Priam as a Frankish king whose people migrated to Macedonia after the fall of Troy. In Macedonia, the Franks then divided. The European Franks reached Francia under King Frankio, just as Romulus went to Rome. Fredegar stated that Theudemir, named king of the Franks by Gregory, was descended from Priam, Frigga, and Frankio. Another work, the Gesta, described how 12,000 Trojans, led by Priam and Antenor, sailed from Troy to the river Don in Russia and on to Pannonia, which is on the river Danube, settling near the Sea of Azov, where they founded a city called Sicambria.
If you watch my video on Trojan Roman Judah and Hellenic Israelites, you'll know that Troy was actually the first colony established by Israelites, which occurred prior to the Exodus while they were still dwelling in Egypt. In this colony lived the descendants of Zerah, but something I can't help to realize is the seemingly large Reubenite component within Troy, which is massively underreported. See, not only can Troy itself be considered the first sign of Jacob's strength, dignity, and power, but it can also be considered an unstable nation that has lost its preeminence due to sexual immorality. See, Troy was considered the chiefest amongst nations, but met its demise at the hands of Dan and Greeks during the Trojan War. As we all know, this conflict was kick-started when Helen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus, was stolen and taken to Troy. Coincidentally, the name of he who stole Helen and committed this adulterous act is Paris, and later on we will see how the city of Paris also ties into the sexual immorality of Reuben. For now, it's important to mention that after the fall of Troy, it was Greece and Macedonia who would rise to prominence in the Mediterranean. These demographics were heavily mixed between the tribes of Dan and Manasseh. Now, Manasseh is the second son of Joseph, and Joseph was the brother whom would receive the birthright after it was stripped from Reuben. It's therefore plausible that Troy had a Reubenite component, as it perfectly fits into prophecy, with the birthright being passed from Reubenite Troy to their Manasseh brothers in Macedonia. Shortly afterwards, we would see the rise of Alexander the Great, who established the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. But with all of this said, this Trojan-Reubenite connection is still an unconfirmed theory that I've heard next to zero mentions of, and I will therefore wait to have it verified before claiming it with absolute certainty. So, let's move on. Besides the origin theories and stories of migrations, the Franks' official introduction into history was in 287 CE, when Roman Emperor Maximian launched a military campaign in Germania against the Franks. The Salian Franks surrendered and became subjects of the Roman Empire. Maximian moved them to Germania Inferior, roughly present-day Belgium, making them the first Germanic tribe to settle permanently within the Roman Empire. They became a powerful ally for Rome, providing many imperial generals, notably Salia and Arbogast. In 324, Bonitus became the first Frank in charge of the Roman militia. In 351, Gaizo becomes the first Roman consul of Frankish blood, followed by Silvanus in 355, Nevita in 362, Merobods in 377, Richemir in 384, and Bato in 385. The Franks integrated remarkably well into Roman society, speaking Latin fluently, obtaining Roman citizenship, and often being promoted by the emperors to consular ranks, including senators. Some of them were even granted the clan name of Flavius, of the royal imperial family. Frankish kingdoms were established within the empire, around Le Mans in northwestern France, Cambrai in northern France, Tournai in Wallonia and Belgium, Trier in the Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany, and Deutz within Cologne, North Rhine, and Germany. Now quickly, you may be asking how this validates the Franks as a sign of strength, dignity, and power. Well, though they were defeated by Romans, this does not mean they were weak or lacked dignity. In fact, they were so powerful and dignified that Romans sought to incorporate them into their own power structure. Also keep in mind that this is only one branch of Reuben, and while these Reubenites chose to side with Rome, their Gallic and Gothic brothers chose to sack Rome. Again, keep in mind that Reuben will be unstable as the waters, therefore explaining this fragmentation of power and allegiance. Now in 395, Claudio the Long-Haired was born. He is considered to be the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, which is named after his son Merovec, aka Merovius. During the reign of Merovec, the Franks seized territory left by the retreating Romans in northern Gaul. They then allied with the Roman Empire and other Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths to halt Attila the Hun in his tracks. After Merovec died, he was succeeded by his son Childeric, who then defeated the Visigoths to take southern Gaul. Now on the note of Reuben's sexual immorality, Childeric was literally stripped of his kingship and taken back to Germany because he was a sexually immoral womanizer. However, during Childeric's absence from the throne, the Franks did not fare well and began falling back into Roman subjugation, further showcasing Reuben's instability. The Franks eventually pleaded with Childeric to return home, and under his rule, they regained a large portion of Gaul. Later on, Childeric's son Clovis would conquer neighboring Frankish tribes in the Low Countries and Rhineland to establish himself as their sole king. He then defeated Syagrius, the last Roman official in northern Gaul, and then the Visigoths in southwestern Gaul, thus ruling over the majority of Gallic territory. But that's not it.
A rejection of the Germanic gods and turning to Christianity also happened among those tribes who had until then been most strongly opposed, as Rheims Cathedral attests. At the end of the 4th century, the Franks had crossed the Rhine to seize the Roman province of Gaul. Deep in the foundations of the cathedral, the remains of Roman hot springs, the public baths, can still be found. Recent excavations have revealed a small pool, previously thought to have been a simple Roman bath. Archaeologists were surprised to find that it was not Roman, but dated from the time of the tribal migrations. Is it, in fact, the church baptistry? And did the christening of a heathen Germanic king from the Frankish tribe of the Sigambrians take place here? Possibly. In any case, it was on Christmas Day, probably in the year 496, that the Frankish king Clovis appeared before Remigius, the bishop of Rheims.
Mitis depone colla, Sigambrea. You from the tribe of the Sigambrians, bow your head.
Clovis, as legend has it, had vowed to be christened if he beat the Alamans at the Battle of Zülpich. He did win.
Worship what you have burnt. Burn what you have worshipped.
Until the day of his victory under the sign of the cross, Clovis had believed in Odin like all his ancestors. Now, he forswore the pagan gods once and for all.
Credis in omnipotentum Deum. Dost thou believe in God the Father Almighty? I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.
Clovis was the first Germanic king to be christened a Roman Catholic, a baptism of far-reaching significance. On that same day in Reims, 3,000 Frankish warriors professed themselves Christians like their king. The Franks were one of the last Germanic tribes to adopt the Christian faith. Under the sign of the cross, Clovis had triumphed over his adversaries. His new faith became the state religion throughout the West. And the Franks too, the new Christians, became the heirs of the disintegrating empire and the founders of a new modern empire under its emperor, Charles the Great, Charlemagne. Like Emperor Marcus Aurelius, he had himself depicted on horseback. On Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope crowned him emperor. He called himself ruler of the Roman Empire. He created the greatest and most lasting empire to emerge from the tribal migrations. Contemporaries called him Pater Europae, the father of Europe. At the end of the great tribal migrations, the Germanic empires of the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks and Anglo-Saxons, and the empires east of the Rhine formed the basis for the future nations of Europe. In search of a new, better homeland, they crossed the entire continent. At the end of their journey, they too were among the founders of Europe and left their mark on the Christian Western world.
Not only was Clovis the first Germanic king to be baptized as a Christian, but he is also the first to be associated with the fleur-de-lis or mandrake flower. See, Clovis's wife Clotilde was from a noble Gothic lineage, whose social rank at the time was far superior to that of Clovis's. It is said that she was the one who convinced him, along with 3,000 of his troops, to convert to Christianity. At this time, Clovis adopted the standard of 3 fleur-de-lis as his royal insignia. From then on, the fleur-de-lis was indissociable from the French Christian monarchs. Now, the historical explanation as to why the symbol of a mandrake was chosen is that the Salian Franks came from a swampy region between what is now France and Belgium. One of the rivers within this region is the Lys, which is known for its abundance of irises and lilies. Many will say it's coincidence, but the tribe of Reuben's primary flower was a mandrake or lily flower. The reason being that Reuben gave them to his mother Leah, which were then used to bribe Rachel into conceiving another son with Jacob. Of course, the mandrake is an aphrodisiac, meaning it increases sexual desire, sexual attraction, sexual pleasure, and sexual behavior. This is yet another link between France, Reuben, and their sexually immoral nature. Nonetheless, Clovis and the Merovingians were the beginning of Christian kings in Europe and paved the path for the rest of Europe's conversion. That said, after Clovis died, his kingdom was divided between his 4 sons. Ironically, Reuben himself also had 4 sons, each having names that are prophetic of France's true identity. In terms of Reuben himself, the etymology can be linked to the Rahabani, who Ptolemy described as inhabiting eastern Scythia. As they enter into Europe, one group to become prominent amongst them are the Ribuari Franks. In the Semitic dialects, R and N are often interchangeable. Thus, Ben and Bar both mean son. For example, consider the term bar mitzvah. For this reason, the Hebrew name of Reuben can also be spelled Rubar, therefore drawing an etymological link between Reuben, Rubar, and Ribuar. Furthermore, the names of Reuben's sons are 1. Hanok, meaning initiated or dedicated. 2. Palu, meaning separated or distinguished. 3. Hezron, meaning enclosed or surrounded by a wall. And 4. Carmi, meaning vine dresser, which is ironic considering France's heavy association with wine. The lineage of Hanok becomes the Henioco-Scythians, and then the Hugo Franks. The lineage of Palu becomes the Palu or Phalian Franks. The lineage of Hezron becomes the Hezroni Franks. And the lineage of Carmi becomes the Carmanian Scythians, who later become the Carini, of which the famous French crusader Geoffrey de Charny is named after. So as we see, there's a parallel between Reuben and the Franks, as well as Clovis and Reuben's 4 sons. But, as you could guess, the division of power between the sons of Clovis caused even more instability amongst the Franks, further validating them as unstable Reubenites. This splintering was the first in a series of events which would lead to the passing of France's throne from the Merovingians to the closely related Carolingians.
We're now going to talk about the Franks. Originally, they were divided into several small bands under chiefs. These bands were politically independent, but they all spoke the same dialect of German. They were Western Germans, and at first they lived along the lower Rhine Valley, just across the river from Roman Gaul. But around 350, the Romans allowed some of these bands to settle in Gaul, and in return, the Franks would be giving soldiers to the Roman army. And in general, they remained loyal to the Roman emperor as long as he lasted. But when the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, a powerful new leader comes about named Clovis, and he unites the Franks both in Gaul and across the Rhine into one single independent state. He also conquered the rest of Gaul, all the way down to the land of the Visigoths in the south. He founded the kingdom of the Franks, and this early kingdom is known as the Merovingians, after the name of Clovis' family, the Merovingians. And they ruled the Franks from 481 to 751. The Merovingians escaped some of these problems that weakened the Germanic kingdoms elsewhere, but they did not escape the independence of their Germanic subjects. Remember that the German people had many great warriors with soldiers of their own who considered themselves equals to the king, and the Franks were no exception. Other Frankish leaders resisted Merovingian efforts to increase their power and to create a stronger government. Frankish kings had to be able soldiers and politicians simply to keep the power that they had, much less extend it. Unfortunately, later Merovingian kings became weaker and weaker, and for a long time traditional loyalty to the family kept them on the throne. But eventually a powerful Frankish lord is going to depose the last Merovingian king and take the crown for himself. This new king was Pepin the Short. In 751, Pepin persuaded other Frankish nobles to elect him king, and thus replaced the Merovingians. But because the Merovingians had ruled for so long, Pepin was afraid that some of his subjects just would not accept his election. He needed a way to provide additional justification for taking power. For that reason, he sought the most respected religious authority in Western Europe, the Pope. The Pope agreed to help Pepin if Pepin helped the Pope. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. Around 750, the territory around Rome was invaded and captured by the Lombards, who controlled northern Italy. Rome at the time was nominally part of the Eastern Roman Empire, and traditionally the popes had relied upon the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople to defend them. But since 726, the popes had been at odds with the emperors, particularly over the issue of iconoclasm, the removing and breaking of statues and icons. So the Pope, Stephen II, turned to Pepin for aid, and Pepin made a deal. Stephen would formally recognize Pepin as the king of the Franks and give him religious approval. In return, Pepin would invade Italy, drive out the Lombards that had conquered all the lands around Rome. In 756, he gave this land to the popes to rule and promised to protect it in the future. It gave the popes an actual territory to govern, a political base, and it became known as the Papal States. This transaction also created the precedent of popes would later claim that they could make or unmake kings. This played a major role in later medieval history, but the main thing immediately was that a new family came to rule the Franks. It was the family of Pepin, and they were called the Carolingians.
Charlemagne, oh wait, wrong guy. Charlemagne, aka Charles the Great, was king of the Franks, king of the Lombards, and first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He succeeded in unifying the majority of Western and Central Europe under Catholicism, and is the first monarch of Israelite descent to be crowned as Christian emperor. His dominion stretched across 1,112,000 square kilometers, making his empire the largest Christian Israelite kingdom to ever exist at the time. Britannica states, although he had only received an elementary level of formal education, Charlemagne possessed considerable native intelligence, intellectual curiosity, a willingness to learn from others, and religious sensibility, all attributes which allowed him to comprehend the forces that were reshaping the world about him. These facets of his persona combined to make him a figure worthy of respect, loyalty, and affection. He was a leader capable of making informed decisions, willing to act on those decisions, and skilled at persuading others to follow them. The ideal warrior chief, Charlemagne was an imposing physical presence blessed with an extraordinary energy, personal courage, and an iron will. He loved the active life, military campaigning, hunting, swimming, but he was no less at home at court, generous with his gifts, a boon companion at the banquet table, and adept at establishing friendships. Never far from his mind was his large family. 5 wives in sequence, several concubines, and at least 18 children. What a I guess it shouldn't be surprising that almost every single European descends from Charlemagne at some point. Just like his sexually immoral forefather, good old Charles couldn't keep it in his pants. I mean, you'd think that this is the reason he is called the Father of Europe, but in reality, that title rather refers to how he united most of Europe under one rule, and was the catalyst for the mass adoption of Christianity within Europe. Now, quick mention. He was heavily associated with the symbol of the mandrake lily flower, which would have been passed on to him from prior monarchs. Some examples of his association with this symbol include the gold bust of Charlemagne, which depicts lily flowers along its base, as well as 13 gemstones around his chest, ultimately representing the 13 tribes of Israel. Another depiction is a 1511 painting done by Albrecht Dürer, in which Charlemagne, looking scarily similar to my father, is situated between 2 heraldic shields, one depicting the Danite eagle, and another depicting the Reubenite mandrake. Later on, we will go even further in depth as to how the Frankish mandrake represents Reuben's sexually immoral nature. But for now, let's get back to the Franks and what occurs after the rule of Charlemagne.
Charlemagne spent the beginning of the 9th century kicking around basically everybody in Western Europe. As a result, he ended up with an empire that spanned from what is now Spain to Germany to Italy. He got himself called emperor, and many thought that his conquests might be the beginning of a Roman Empire restored. Then he died. Tragically, but also luckily for his empire, by the time he kicked it, he had only one son left, so the empire passed from his hands to that of his son basically intact. But his son had 3 sons of his own, and Carolingian law had an interesting quirk to it. It wasn't ruled by primogeniture, the idea that all inheritance goes to the firstborn son. Now, we often criticize primogeniture today as it favors only one son, leaves women out entirely, and sometimes leads to rebellions by younger sons with little to lose and everything to gain. But we are about to see why it became the dominant system. Because what happens when you can't leave your whole empire to one person? Well, that means that you've got to carve it up and hand parts of it to, in this case, each son. So all of that work that you did to put together some great empire just becomes a bunch of squabbling states again as soon as you're out of the picture. And how do states squabble, especially at this time? Well, they go to war with each other. So when Charlemagne's son eventually legged it to the great beyond and left each of his sons with their own kingdoms, they immediately went at each other's throats to try to take the pieces of the old empire back from the other ones. Which is where this map comes in. Now, the first thing you will probably notice about that map is that it is completely bonkers. Whether or not you know anything about Europe, you can probably tell that this middle country is completely untenable. It's got an enormous border to guard on both sides, and it's surrounded by larger, more cohesive states. And if you do know anything about Europe, you're probably even more confused, because this makes no sense geographically. I mean, it's filled with mountains and rivers, and yet those features aren't being used to define much of its borders. But in terms of population, it's even weirder. The Western Frankish kingdom is mostly Franks, or French. The Eastern Frankish kingdom is almost entirely Germanic, but the middle is just a mix of everybody. Germans, French, Italians, and people who consider themselves none of those 3. That middle kingdom just feels kind of haphazard. And sure enough, its 2 bigger, more sensibly formed neighbors on either side basically roll over it pretty quickly. The Italian part becomes its own thing, and the East and West Francia sort of split up the rest. But this one act, this one-time haphazard split of an empire meant to provide kingdoms for sons, has had enormous historical consequences. Because take one more look at that territory. Now just ignore that Italian part for a moment, and what do you see? What you're left with is a place that a surprising number of the major Western European conflicts of the modern era have been fought over, and even more have been fought in. Let's just look at the list. We've got the 30 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, much of the pre-Napoleonic battles of the French Revolution, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, and, within the realm of argument, also World War II. Why is this the case? Why do so many conflicts erupt right here? I would argue that it's because of the way that this one haphazard decision to carve out a kingdom for sons made centuries before interacted with a notion that came centuries later: national identity. Because Western Francia would eventually become France, and Eastern Francia would eventually become Germany, but no clear line was ever established as to who that middle bit belonged to. And because the middle bit contained both French speakers and German speakers, people who both neighboring nations would consider ethnically part of their nation and their lost people, the 2 biggest powers in Western Europe would continually get into conflict over the issue. And that part about national identity is key, because for a little over 700 years after Middle Francia fell apart, this wasn't really an issue. Sure, there were some conflicts here and there, but not of the severity or the frequency that we see thereafter. While Europe was simply a bunch of fragmented kingdoms where people had more allegiance to their local noble, or at best their king, than some idea of a nation, any disputes were based on the desires of feudal lords, on questions of birth and rights by title, rather than some idea of the national boundaries of a state or the unity of a people. But as those ideas of national identity begin to take shape, that decision, made more than half a millennia before, begins to influence events in ways that no one could possibly anticipate when it was made. And we see this all over, mirrored in our world even today.
West Francia, which became the Kingdom of France, covered most of the territory familiar to us today, but for a while it was a very disunited and non-centralized power. In fact, I use the word kingdom very liberally, as the king really had no power at all in comparison to the princes, dukes, and clergy. Sure, he could sit on a throne and call himself king, but it was nothing more than a glorified title. One of the real problems came during the Norman conquest of 1066, in which William the Conqueror became King of England while still remaining a subject to the French crown as Duke of Normandy, and I'm sure that won't become a problem anytime soon. Hugh of Capet seized power when he was elected in 987, establishing the Capetian dynasty. However, again, the title of king meant very little. The French during this period answered the call to crusade with fervour, and the Catholic Church grew in significant importance, with the clergy holding much power and influence in the region. With each passing decade, the Kingdom of France lost more and more land to the Anglo-Norman kings, to a point where all-out war was fought between Philip II and Richard the Lionheart. But with Richard's death in 1199, Philip managed to conquer much of his holdings in France. Tensions came to a boiling point after the death of Charles IV, since his only legal successor would have been the English Edward III, and a war was erupted in the disputed lands lasting more than a century, thereafter known as the 100 Years' War. During the war, the countryside was ravaged by the Black Death, and when all signs were pointing to an English victory, a pious peasant girl named Joan of Arc lifted the English siege and helped repel the English from French soil. In 1477, France won the western half of Burgundy in a war with the Habsburgs, and in 1532 incorporated the Duchy of Brittany, greatly expanding her territory. France became a European superpower in the next few centuries, notably fighting a war with their neighbours for land, fighting another war with their neighbours for religion, starting a sizable colonial empire in the New World, fought another war with their neighbours for land, and became involved in the American Revolution.
Obviously, this is even more proof as to how France can be deemed an unstable nation, whether it be internally or externally. Nonetheless, towards the 16th century, the French once again fulfill the prophecy of Genesis 49, verse 3. Keep in mind that as the birthright tribe, the law of Moses entitled Reuben to inherit a double portion of his father's blessings, some of which include becoming a great nation, inhabiting islands and coastlands located northwest of Jerusalem, becoming a military superpower, possessing the gates of their enemies, gaining great wealth and economic prosperity, becoming a royal kingdom, and much more. Therefore, as the birthright son and first sign of Jacob's strength, dignity, and power, Reuben would inherit these blessings and become prominent worldwide. Now, I often hear the argument that France was the first of all European nations to expand its territorial reach across the earth and obtain global possessions. However, this is slightly false. The reason being that Spain had actually reached the Americas 2 centuries prior to the French, therefore beating them as the first European empire with intercontinental possessions. That said, keep in mind that there was also a massive Reubenite component within Spain due to tribes such as the Visigoths, Gauls, and to a lesser extent, Franks. We can also see the fleur-de-lis symbolism throughout Spain, most notably on their national flag and coat of arms, which we will later delve into and expand upon. Regardless, whether it be Spain or France, it was still Reuben who was first to colonize and gain overseas possessions. That said, many of us are aware of the atrocities committed by Spanish conquistadors, which may cast doubt on the validity of their Israelite descent and whether they carry the trait of dignity or have respect for others' dignity. Well, while it's true that the Spanish sought to conquer and subjugate the natives, the French worked in partnership with them and formed a camaraderie that would permeate throughout the centuries. Traces of this alliance can be found throughout Canadian history, with its biggest testament being the Micmac tribe. This was a distinct population, both genetically and culturally mixed between indigenous Americans and French settlers. Britannica states that they were amongst the first indigenous peoples to accept Jesuit teachings and to intermarry with the settlers of New France. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Micmac were allies of the French against the English, frequently traveling south to raid the New England frontiers. The cooperation of the Micmac and French against the British slowed the growth of the colony of Nova Scotia and hampered British success in war. Ironically, This alliance can also tie into Reuben's sexual immorality and the passing of his birthright. The reason being that Genesis 49 verse 4 implies forbidden relationships as a cause for the passing of Reuben's blessings to Ephraim. Keep in mind that on many occasions throughout the Bible, the Israelites are instructed to marry within and to form relationships with other Israelites. Those who did not follow this instruction and chose to mingle with foreigners would surely see the consequences of such actions. Offspring of these forbidden relationships were referred to as mamzers and were often considered to be cursed. Well, the Micmac by definition are mamzers, and the French literally worked in companion with them to destroy their British Ephraimite brothers. So while France did decide to carry themselves with dignity and not genocide or subjugate an entire demographic, they also committed sexually immoral acts which again played into their Reubenite character and deemed them unworthy of holding the birthright. At the time, it wouldn't have been so clear as to whether France would maintain their power or be defeated. But in hindsight, the passing of the birthright was a definite and had been foreshadowed for centuries by France's gradual instability and lack of cohesion. Around the 18th century, we have France getting into tons of internal conflicts, with a waning hold on its own territory, all while its citizens are splintering into combative political groups with opposing interests. This results in the French Revolution, which began in 1789 and lasted until 1799. Many people lost their lives during this bloodthirsty revolution, as it's been estimated that about 1,240,000 people perished throughout this period. This was called the Reign of Terror, as the clergy, aristocrats, royal family, and many other prominent people were beheaded by guillotine, hung, or drowned. This brings Deuteronomy 33 verse 6 to 9, as Moses pleads with Yahweh, "Let Reuben live and not die, nor his men be few." It seems that Moses knew of a time where great trouble would fall upon the men of Reuben. A time in which the Reubenites would need the grace of God to fall upon them if they wanted to survive. Ironically, the term "let Reuben live" is synonymous with Vive la France, which traces its roots to Bastille Day, a French national holiday commemorating the storming of the Bastille, which marked the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, we have gone over the mandrake, but there is another Reubenite symbol that holds prophetic relevance to France and this very revolution. This is a primal man or a man's face, which can be seen in numerous locations with history linking to France. An article I found online writes, "Not only does this link to Reuben's name, which means look, a son, but also to the humanism movement which emerged out of the French Revolution. Humanism is the worship of man and man's capabilities over that of God. The man standard of Reuben is also heavily linked to the revolutionary declaration of the rights of man. The godless ideas of the French Revolution have had a very strong influence on world history and have spread to many nations. After the French Revolution, Napoleon became the dictator of France. In 1801, Napoleon was formally crowned as emperor by the Pope, which came about after he restored some of the privileges of the Roman Catholic Church. Many of the changes that came out of the French Revolution were formalized by the Code of Napoleon, which became the basis of modern France's legal system. As is well known, much of continental Europe was conquered by Napoleon, including the German states. At this point, Napoleon was at the peak of his power. Nevertheless, this was not to last. As far as God is concerned, Ephraim is his firstborn, not Reuben. A coalition of 4 major powers, including Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, put an end to Napoleon's imperialistic dreams once and for all. In 1815, the British forces were particularly prominent in defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. After this time, France was never to become preeminent again. From this time on, the descendants of Joseph within the British Commonwealth and North America exercised the preeminence of the birthright blessing amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. End quote. This era marked the transfer of the birthright from Reuben to Ephraim. Throughout this power transfer, France lost nearly all its global possessions to the British Commonwealth, which till this day is still the only nation to become a company of nations.
In the early 17th century, through the great expansion of the late 19th century, the French Overseas Empire acquired Canada, Louisiana, several West Indian islands, and part of India for France. Then in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the French lost Canada due to defeat by Wolfe at Plains of Abraham. They also lost India to the British, and in 1803 Napoleon I sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. Also by 1850, only the West Indian Sugar Islands and some scattered African and Asian posts remained French. So this is why was this, brethren? Well, because of 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 2. The British became the colonial power, and the America, of course, rose to be the greatest nation in the world because, 1 Chronicles 5:2 and 5:1, the birthright was Joseph's. Even though Reuben was the firstborn, the birthright now it was given to Joseph, and Joseph's son Ephraim, England, and Manasseh, America, acquired all the things that France acquired as the first. However, you see, French, nevertheless, France went on to form a second empire between 1830 and 1870, so that will be in the 19th century, when Louis Philippe's forces penetrated Algeria, and Napoleon III seized Cochin China in Southeastern Asia. And in Southeast Asia, the French pieced together the colony of Indochina by 1893, adding Laos, Cambodia or Kampuchea, Annam, and Tonkin to Cochin China. And also in the 19th century, if you might know, Tunisia and Morocco, they still speak, there's still French presence there, at least in language department. Tunisia and Morocco became protectorates. So the France's vast African empire, brethren, also including French Equatorial Africa, French West Africa, French Somaliland, now Djibouti, and the islands of Madagascar and the Comoros. So that was the second, empire that France acquired. Now then came the 20th century, the last century, and in the 1960s and 1962, France lost 12 autonomous African republics and Algeria, and of the overseas territories, the Comoros declared their independence in 1975, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon became an overseas department in 1976, and French Somaliland became independent Djibouti in 1977. So, you see, they lost the world dominance because it was given over to the British and to the Americans, brethren.
The instability that led France to lose its preeminence carried on even after they lost all their colonies. It is written that prior to 1958, the French exhibited profound instability in their nation, changing governments at an incredible rate. The Encyclopedia Americana has noted that during the 70 years of the Third Republic, from 1875 to 1945, more than 100 cabinets succeeded one another, with an average tenure in office of less than 8 months. Now lastly, I want to add that in my video identifying the tribe of Gad, we saw that the only nation to ever overcome Switzerland was France. However, they shortly afterwards lost this possession, as the Swiss Confederacy was revamped. Again, the French have been quite unstable in their grasp for control, and this is visible throughout their chronological possession of territory throughout time. Essentially, France's domination of both land and sea showcased the strength of Catholic empires and Israelite nations. Their knack for civilized living proved them to be the dignity of Europe. They were also the first sign of Christian Israelite strength on a global scale. That being said, instability would cause their hold on power to wane, with them eventually losing preeminence to the British. See, I've gone over the mandrake being an aphrodisiac, Merovingian kings seeking many wives, Kildaric being a womanizer, Charlemagne having more children than NBA Youngboy and Chief Keef combined. But what I haven't gotten into is the French population in its entirety. So obviously, the loss of the birthright occurred as a result of Reuben's promiscuity. And when it comes to romance, love, and an overly sexual nature, which nation on earth is best known for these traits? That would be France.
And talking about a period of inflamed passion, which country is largely synonymous with love? Of course, it's France, and in particular the city of Paris. Even the French language is known as the language of love. Even centuries ago, during the heights of the French monarchy, while other nations were very much absorbed in a lot of prudish customs, travelers to France would write about just the sheer number of prostitutes on the street, along with just the overtly crude, shameless immodesty of even the upper classes in conversation and in clothing. And really, it's unfortunate to say that not much has changed today, as a lot of statistics show. France has one of the lowest marriage rates in all of Europe. That may come as a surprise, but it doesn't have any bearing on anything, because in the early 2000s, France was labeled the most sexually active country in the world. And all of this has resulted in an estimated 60% of children born out of wedlock in France, which is the highest number in all of Europe. I found a whole lot of statistics relating to France and Paris specifically. I won't go through them because a lot of them are pretty shocking. But needless to say, according to one survey, the number of people that the average Parisian has slept with is 19. And nearly 1 in 2 have had relations with a partner without first knowing their name. So France, and especially Gay Paris, really lives up to that licentiousness of the ancestor Reuben.
This may be why in 2019, France was the member state with the highest total fertility rate in the European Union, with 1.86 live births per woman. And it's not like this is anything new, as in the 19th century, France had the largest population in Western Europe. Anybody with French ancestry who has done their family tree will know exactly how true this is. Each couple birthed numerous children, sometimes having multiple with the same names. In this case, it was often because one child died early on, a scenario that seemingly occurred quite often. I believe this can also tie into Moses' request with Yahweh to let Reuben live, as conditions were tough and innocent children lived short, brutal lives. Now, there is one last link between sexual promiscuity and the French, which is a bit more low-key than others. As we know, the motto of France is liberty, equality, fraternity. This motto can be traced back to the French Revolution and humanism movement. We also know of another location where liberty is a trademark of their society. That is the United States, whose liberty is symbolized by the Statue of Liberty. Many are aware that this statue was gifted to America by France. But what most people are unaware of is that the Statue of Liberty is actually a depiction of the Whore of Babylon.
Prophets use the word her. This is another very precise clue given to us through metaphors and symbolism that are so abundant in the Holy Book. Think fast. What was the most widely known symbol of America? What is the image most immigrants and tourists associate with the U.S.? Is it a woman symbolizing liberty that sits in the harbor of the most important city in the United States? This is very cryptic but important, as it shows how accurate the prophecy is. The prophets talk about the U.S. by using its most recognizable monument, the Statue of Liberty. So why on earth are they also calling it the Whore of Babylon? The sculptor of the Statue of Liberty was Auguste Bertholdi, a Mason belonging to the Great Masonic Lodge in Paris. Before beginning the Statue of Liberty, Bertholdi was seeking a commission to construct a giant statue of the goddess of fertility. Isis, as it was known to the Egyptians, or Ishtar to the ancient Babylonians. The Romans also adopted this fertility goddess, but they changed the name to Libertas in Latin. Liberty in English, Libertas, is the mythological equivalent of Isis and Ishtar. Therefore, the Statue of Liberty is also the statue of Isis, or as the Babylonians called her, Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, love, and sex. According to the ancient pagan rituals, one can only be purified of sin after intercourse with a temple priest or a priestess of Ishtar. In return for this salvation, a gift offering was needed. Ishtar was the patron mother of the temple priestesses and priests. She was the mother of what we would call today prostitution. This is why Ishtar was seen by early Christians as the Whore of Babylon. And that is why the Statue of Liberty, the symbol of America, is called by the prophets the Whore of Babylon. Do you think it is a coincidence that the U.S., the home of the greatest and most famous statue of Ishtar, provides 65% of pornographic movies and adult entertainment to the world? Is it just another coincidence that this is the country where sexual liberation originated and spread to the rest of the world? It's not. It's just like the scriptures foretold. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication.
In another video, I will expand upon New York and its tie to Mystery Babylon. For now, understand that the USA comes from Joseph, as Ephraim and Manasseh are the United Kingdom and United States. America is not Babylon, New York is. See, after the collapse of Rome, papal bloodlines and Masonic institutions rebranded in York, England, hence York Rite Masonry. They later moved their base of operations to New York, where the United Nations headquarters is currently situated. It can therefore be concluded that New York in specific seems to be Mystery Babylon, making it an aspect of the Americas, but not the entirety of the US and Canada, who are in fact sons of Joseph. Now moving on from Reuben's sexual promiscuity, I've already mentioned how the humanism movement ties into Reuben's symbol of a man. So let's now get into a few of Reuben's other symbols. Like I mentioned before, the most prominent of all Reubenite symbols is the mandrake, which unbeknownst to many actually traces back to Scythia. Now, as I've explained, since being adopted as a royal emblem by Clovis I, the mandrake became synonymous with the French monarchs. It's for this reason that we can see it on flags, coinage, art, and much more. That the French kings long used the fleur-de-lis as an emblem of their sovereignty is undisputable. On his seal of 1060, before heraldry became formalized, Philip I sits on his throne holding a short staff that terminates in a fleur-de-lis. A similar staff appears in the Great Seal of Louis VII, whose signet ring was charged with a single fleur-de-lis. Louis VII is believed to have been the first to use the azur sem fleur-de-lis on his shield. However, its use on banners, and especially on the royal oriflamme, may have been earlier. Uses of it can still be found outside of France in locations such as Quebec, where it's proudly depicted on their provincial flag. Another symbol we haven't gone over much is the unstable waters. As we've seen throughout this video, instability was a trait of the tribe of Reuben, and can definitely be applied to the French, as their history is riddled with both internal and external conflict, political strife, war, and revolution. This is symbolized through the emblem of unsteady ocean waves, which can be seen on numerous territorial coat of arms within France. Of course, there had to have been Reubenites in Spain, and as I've made a case for throughout this video, it seemingly comes through the Visigoths. This is why the Spanish are entitled to bear the emblem of unstable waters as well as the fleur-de-lis on their national flag and coat of arms. Now, when it comes to national flags, it can easily be assumed that France's holds little to no meaning. In reality, if you've seen my other videos, you would know that the red, white, and blue have been associated time and time again with Adamic empires, spanning all the way from Egypt to France to Britain to the United States, each being locations with prominent R1b lineage. I've also gone into how the R1b haplogroup are primary carriers of rhesus negative blood, which comes with a plethora of extremely unique traits. Some of these traits include red hair, white skin, blue eyes, and prominent blue veins. Obviously, these traits are what separates this bloodline from others and makes them the most genetically unique hominids on Earth. It is for this reason that I believe the red, white, and blue colors have been so prominent amongst our nations, in specific, birthright nations. Ironically, these locations carry the highest rates of both Rh negative blood and R1b Y-DNA. For the sake of saving time, I will ask that you watch my video on Rh negative lost tribes of Israel, as well as my 2 episodes debunking Black Hebrew Israelites regarding the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Gad. This will allow you to gain a greater understanding as to how the R1b haplogroup is Israelite and Rh negative blood is Adamic. For now, I'd like to focus on proving that France itself is an R1b predominant nation, as it will even further corroborate the claims I've made in prior videos. As we know, the R1b lineage matches the exact migrations of the sons of Noah in contemporary periods. Traces of this ancient migration can be seen through the genetic footprint of R1b males in the Middle East, Levant, Egypt, down the Nile, and westwards through rivers connecting into Lake Chad. Today, R1b is the most common haplogroup in Western Europe, reaching over 80% of the population in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, France, Basque Country, and Catalonia. It is also common in Anatolia and around the Caucasus, as well as Russia and in Central and South Asia. Now, when it comes to the Gauls, 16 Iron Age samples from ancient Gaul were tested by Brunel et al. In 2020. All but one of these samples were female, so no Y chromosomal DNA is available for them. That said, the one male sample belonged to Y haplogroup R1b L21. The next set of data comes from a multi-scale archaeogenetic study of 2 French Iron Age communities, from internal social to broad-scale population dynamics, by Fisher et al. J. Archaeological Society. In it, Fisher and colleagues update their previous data for the Y-DNA of Gauls from the Urville-Nacqueville necropolis in Normandy, dating to 300 BC. 8 of the samples belong to haplogroup R, with at least 5 of them being R1b. They also reported new data from a Gallic cemetery at Gurgi in southern Paris, dating to 120 BC. 19 of these samples belong to haplogroup R, with at least 13 being R1b. So we can see that the Gauls carried large portions of R1b Y-DNA, which seem to have been their primary haplotype, with R1a coming second. When we move to the Goths, noted DNA researcher and project manager Dr. David Fox has suggested that being positive for R1b S21 may be proof of descent from the Visigoths or Western Goths. Reason being that the presence of R1b S21 throughout Europe can be attributed almost exclusively to Germanic migrations that took place between the 3rd and 10th centuries. Phrygians and Anglo-Saxons disseminated this haplogroup to England and the Scottish lowlands, the Franks to Belgium and France, the Burgundians to eastern France, the Suebi to Galicia and northern Portugal, and the Lombards to Austria and Italy. The Goths helped propagate S21 around Eastern Europe, but apparently their Germanic lineages were progressively diluted by blending with Slavic and Balkanic populations. Later on, the Danish and Norwegian Vikings also contribute to the diffusion of R1b S21, alongside I1, I2b1, and R1a, around much of Western Europe, but mainly in Iceland, the British Isles, Normandy, and southern Italy. All of this corroborates a Scythian rather than Scandinavian origin for the Goths. In terms of the Franks, based on the results from the Benelux Y-DNA project, it can be inferred that the Franks' main paternal lineage was haplogroup R1b U106, and that they belonged overwhelmingly to the Z381 subclade. They also possessed other typical Germanic lineages, such as IA, I2A2A, and R1A. Although their ratio to R1b U106 would have been 1:2, 1:6, and 1:7, meaning the majority were R1b. Like modern Scandinavians, the Franks likely carried a substantial amount of R1b P312 lineages, including the L21, U152, and DF27 subclades, as well as a minority of EV13, G2A, and J2. In Italy, the Franks conquered the Lombard kingdom in 774. Contrarily to other Germanic tribes before them, the aim of the Franks was not to find a new homeland. Consequently, they did not migrate en masse to Italy. They only brought soldiers and administrators like the Romans had done when expanding their empire. Their genetic print is therefore more elusive, although their genetic footprint can be traced through portions of R1b U106 in Italy. When it comes to the Merovingian dynasty, a 2018 study by O'Sullivan tested the genomes of Merovingian nobles from an early medieval Alemannic graveyard. Apart from one individual belonging to haplogroup G2A, all men were members of R1b, and all samples that yielded deep clade results fell under the R1b U106 to Z325 subclade. The lineage of the kings of France was inferred from the Y-DNA of several descendant branches, and also belongs to R1b U106 down to the Z381 subclade. Their earliest known male-to-male ancestor was from Robert II, Count of Hesbaye, a Frankish nobleman from present-day Belgium. The House of Wedden, one of the oldest dynasties in Europe, was yet another well-known noble Germanic lineage of the R1b U106 Z381 subclade. Now, with all of that said, there is still speculation that the true Israelite haplogroup is E1b, and that since Napoleon Bonaparte carries this Y-DNA, it validates them as being Reubenites. Strongly suggest you watch my last video, titled My Reply to RH Negative Liquid Records of Truth. In this video, I explain how Napoleon being E1b rather corroborates my claims that the R1b haplogroup are the true paternal descendants of Israel. For now, I believe I've said enough. By now it should be evident that the Seminoles are far from fulfilling the prophecy of Reuben, and that France and its ancestral tribes were the first sign of Jacob's strength, dignity, and power. I'm not even sure this video will render, as this is by far my longest video yet, and I've already had trouble with prior uploads. Regardless, I greatly appreciate all the support, and I love having people to voice my information to. So I hope you all have a great day and stay blessed.